you are not really sick of me by the end of it. I think the first presentation now, and I'm hoping that my second presentation, or the last one tomorrow, will be ones that are most accessible and I hope provide you with a good overview of the sort of work that can be done and that is being done with price transmission tools. My second presentation today, we'll see. It's a bit more technical and might not be so suitable, but I'll make a strong effort to put it into practical terms for you. But the idea of this very first presentation is to give you an overview of what is price transmission analysis. I'll try to get out of the way here a little bit. Okay. So it's an introduction to the topics and the methods, and I hope it will provide you with some terminology that we commonly use and with an idea of what are the strengths but also the weaknesses and limitations of this sort of analysis. The questions that the Minister and some of you have already referred to are complicated questions. They're difficult questions, and they're also politically controversial. And if answers were easy, then we would have provided them a long time ago. But the answers often are not easy. And for that reason, this is an ongoing area of scientific research. We're doing applied work, but we are also still in academic circles discussing and debating the tools and the possibilities. So it's not as if we have a finished product that we can just pull from the shelf and provide easy answers to all of your questions. I'm going to talk a little bit about some definitions and about the relevance of the topic, then a little bit about the theoretical basis of the tools we use, the estimation methods that we use, and some conclusions. Okay. First of all, what is price transmission? There is a definition that goes back to an article by Fackler and Goodwin, and that is in the academic literature, perhaps sort of the main article that everyone refers back to, the survey article. And it simply states that price transmission is the degree to which demand and supply shocks arising in one region are transmitted to other regions. Okay? And of course, we've had these massive international food price shocks in 2007, 2008, and currently, and one of the main topics has been in our area of work in recent years, the question, are these shocks being transmitted, for example, to domestic markets, local markets around the world, and what determines whether or not they are being transmitted? This work is done in two contexts. The first is the spatial context. So, as an example, we're looking at the prices for milling wheat or for maize or rice in different locations on the globe or within a country. So often we're looking here at questions of transmission of prices from international markets to border prices to inland prices at domestic locations where production or consumption takes place. The other context is the vertical context. And here we're looking, for example, at prices for milling wheat, again, as an example, but then flour and then bread. In other words, the further processed products that come from milling wheat. Okay? And we're looking at a common location. So here we're looking at the typical food chain that goes from a producer to a processor, perhaps to a wholesaler, to a retailer, and ultimately to the consumer. So we have prices being transmitted horizontally in space and vertically in the food chain. And many of the problems that are interesting in policy circles, of course, involve elements of both, the vertical and the spatial context. Some more definitions or terms that are fairly often used in the price transmission literature. One is the question of the extent of price transmission. Okay? Is a price shock transmitted completely from one market to the next or only partially? And here the term in the scientific literature is often the law of one price. And just as an example here, to maybe depict this graphically for you, if we have a situation here, here we're looking at prices developing over time, and here is the price axis, and we have two markets, B and A. Okay? And we have here the development of the price in B, and here the development of the price in A, and the prices are separated by some margin, X. which could be, for example, the processing margin. So this would be the price of wheat, and this would be the price of flour, maybe, and this would be the price of processing the wheat, the cost of processing the wheat into flour. Well, if, for example, the price of the product in the one market increases, will the price on the other market increase by the same amount? Do we have full price transmission to restore the original margin? Or do we maybe only have partial price transmission so that after the fact, so that after the fact, the margin has been increased somehow? And these issues, of course, are often tied to questions of market power, or what is happening to the other costs in the chain. Maybe the cost of processing has increased, so maybe for that reason X has had to increase, and so on. Another important issue in price transmission is not just the extent, but also the question of the speed of the transmission. How quickly does a price shock get transmitted from one market to another? And here again, in graphical terms, that would be, for example, the situation where the price transmission is more or less instantaneous, compared with a situation where the price transmission maybe takes a certain amount of time. And this can be due to a number of factors. This can be due to simple delays in information transmission. It can be due to the time it takes to physically trade a product, to move it from one market to another. It can also be due to menu costs and so on, all sorts of things that could play a role here. Beside the extent and the speed, a topic that is raised quite often is the question of the symmetry or asymmetry of price transmission, and there will be a more detailed presentation on this later today. Okay. The issue here is whether increasing shocks are transmitted the same as decreasing shocks. And to put that in context here, again, that would be a situation where, for example, if the price on this market increases by a certain amount, does the price on the other market increase by the same amount? Or, for example, if the price decreases, does the price response on the other market perhaps turn out to be a bit smaller? So that in one direction the margin is maintained, but in the other direction the margin can somehow grow. And this is something that farmers often suspect processors are doing to them, right? That cost increases are passed on immediately and quickly by processors, but that cost decreases are not, that processors take advantage of these to extend or stretch the margin. And this is something we can measure. We'll talk about that a bit more today. Finally, another term which is becoming increasingly important, it's a technical term, but I think it has some practical implications for you, is the question of what we would call regime dependence. Okay? The idea that you might have, over time, different phases in which the price transmission behaves differently. And this could, for example, be for policy reasons. And I'll try to give you an example of that. Imagine here that we have a price development on one market. Here, over time, the price is going up and down. This could be, for example, the world market price for an important food grain like wheat or maize or rice. Okay? Now, we have perhaps a country that exports to the world market. A country like, if we're taking wheat, I would think immediately of a country like Ukraine or Russia, which is worried that when the world market prices get too high, that there will be too much export out of the country, and that domestic prices will also increase too much. So they might be tempted, for example, in phases where the world market prices are high, to impose export restrictions or price controls of some sort. And as a result of that, you might see that the prices in this exporting country follow a slightly different trend, right? When the prices on the world market are relatively low, there is transmission. But when the prices on the world market climb, this country decouples itself, separates itself from the world market, right, by imposing an export restriction, for example. And only once the world market prices have come down again does it reintegrate itself with the world market. And we refer to this as regime-dependent price transmission because there are different regimes or phases taking place here, separated by the implementation of some sort of a policy tool. And to make that more concrete, here is an example of, specifically because it's an area where I do some work, Ukraine and wheat exports. From Ukraine, which is the blue price down below here, to the world market, which is the golden or yellow-colored price up above. Okay. And this is the phase from about the end of 2004 until quite recently now, until sometime in 2011. And in this phase, 3 times, here, here, and here, the Ukrainian government imposed export restrictions, quotas or bans. And you see exactly that this happened. Whenever that happened, the domestic prices did not increase the same way that the world market did. This way, they decoupled themselves from the world market. So we get some different phases here or regimes of price transmission. And analyzing these to understand what impacts domestic policies in some countries have on, for example, the world market or other countries is also something that we do in price transmission analysis. So why is this an important topic, or why is it interesting? What are the sorts of things that people ask us to do price transmission analysis about? Well, of course, one of the most important things, and certainly the one that in recent years has been most in demand, I mentioned it earlier in my presentation, is the question of implications for poverty and hunger. Okay. Since we've had the 2 strong international price peaks in the last 5 years, there has been renewed interest, renewed demand in price transmission analysis to try to understand what the implications of these peaks are for poverty, for hunger, especially in the developing world. In some countries, I'm thinking here especially of North America, where this is done quite often. It's not so common in Europe, where we tend to take a more legalistic view of competition policy. But in the United States, for example, colleagues of mine have sometimes been asked to give expert evidence in competition policy hearings. If 2 companies want to, 2 big meat processors want to fuse, to join together, for example, the competition authority will look at this and see whether or not it is perhaps going to lead to too much concentration in the industry. And one of the questions that is relevant in this regard is, what is the size of the relevant market? Where is the limit of price transmission in this market? Because that sort of defines the geographic extent of the market. And only once we know how big the market is geographically can we then think about whether or not the new firm that's going to be created by this fusion is too big or too small or whatever for that geographic market. Another thing that might not interest you so much directly because it's not so immediately policy relevant, but if you think of all of the big agricultural policy simulation models that are used by the FAO, by the OECD, the GTAP model, the FAPRI, all these models that are used to make predictions or simulations of world market developments, well, they all have in them, at least implicitly, sometimes it's a bit hidden, but inside those models, you have to have price transmission coefficients. You have to somehow model that. There's something in that model that always tells you that if the world market price increases, what's going to happen to domestic prices? And these people are sometimes asking us for a bit of help. Often they use some fairly simplistic assumptions. Often they assume the law of one price, perfect and immediate price transmission in these models. But that's often an unrealistic assumption. Finally, something that at least moves me is just the pure scientific curiosity. When you think of how fundamentally important price theory is for all of economics, and then you start looking at individual markets and looking at how prices really work, you realize that there's still an awful lot we do not know, that we don't understand. And that's why I find this work fairly interesting as well. So, a little bit now about the theoretical basis. Where is our theoretical foundation for the empirical work that we do? First of all, in the area of spatial or horizontal price transmission, what we have is a body of economic theory that defines what's sometimes called the spatial arbitrage condition. The idea here fundamentally is that when you have prices at different locations, you have traders or arbitrageurs who observe these prices at different locations. And if the prices get too far apart, these traders see opportunities to make money by buying cheap and selling dear. By buying in the low price market and selling in the high price market, of course, they push up the prices in the low price market and they push down the prices in the high price market until some sort of equilibrium is established, is reestablished. And this equilibrium is what's called the spatial arbitrage condition. It says that the difference between two prices, PA and PB, cannot be larger than the transport costs, or let's say in more general terms, the transaction costs of moving the goods from B to A. Yeah? If this condition is violated, if the difference becomes larger, then trade will take place and cause the prices to adjust until the condition is restored again. No? If the condition is in the other direction, so that the difference is less than the transaction costs, then trade isn't interesting. The prices can move independently of one another. Basic stuff, but it's what underlies our work. This implies something that I was talking about before. This implies regime-dependent price transmission, because it means you will have phases where trade is taking place and the two prices are linked to each other, and other phases where trade is not taking place and the prices can move around within a certain limit independently of one another. When we think about vertical price transmission, don't let that scare you. It's just a formula, but we're not going to have to go into the details. But when we think about vertical price transmission, the foundation is provided by Bruce Gardner, a very well-known agricultural economist who was in Maryland for many years. I'm sure some of you have heard of his name, who unfortunately passed away a few years ago. He published an article in 1975 called Farm Retail Price Spread in a Competitive Food Industry. And this is the foundation, I think, of most of the work we do in this field. Okay? And in it, he develops a simple model of a food processing industry that takes an agricultural raw product, such as wheat, a number of other inputs like labor and energy and capital and so on, and combines them into a food product. And then he studies what happens if the agricultural commodity price increases, what impact will that have on the food price, and so on and so forth. And he derives formulas like this that at first glance look kind of ugly, but fundamentally they're simpler than they look, and you can work with them a little bit. They tell you that the transmission of prices here from the retail level to the, from the raw product level to the food level, that this transmission depends on a number of things, such as, for example, here, the substitution possibilities between the different types of inputs, and so on and so forth. The nice thing about this formula is that in many sort of standard settings, it simplifies a lot. It simplifies basically to this SF. And S is the share, the cost share of the different products in the end product. Okay? So just to put this in practical terms, if we're looking, for example, at wheat and flour, okay, this formula here tells us that if the wheat price increases by 1%, we will expect the flour price to increase by roughly the cost share of wheat in the total cost of producing flour. And that happens to be about 80%. So we would expect that a $1 per ton increase in wheat prices should generally lead to about an 80-cent per ton or increase in flour prices, for example. Yeah? If products and production is more complicated, wheat to flour is fairly straightforward. But if you're talking about brewing beer from barley and a number of other products, it starts to get more complicated. No? But this theory provides us with the foundations that we need there to understand and to develop theories and hypotheses that we want to test. In recent years, a group of researchers in the UK, Tim Lloyd and others, have taken the simple Gardner model, which assumes competition. When Bruce Gardner did this work here, he was assuming that there's perfect competition in the processing industry. And we suspect in many cases that that is not the case. So Tim Lloyd and his authors have taken this work and they have elaborated on it to also account for the possibility of imperfect competition, market power, oligopoly, or monopoly situations. The formulas get uglier, of course. They get more complicated. As a result, that's often the case. But they nevertheless provide us with some guidance for our empirical work. So what about the estimation methods? What do people do to actually carry out price transmission analysis? Well, in the early years, the first papers, if you look back, they go back to the 1960s and 70s and the early 1980s. You get a lot of work basically, just done using correlation coefficients. So what is the correlation between price A and price B? The problem with that sort of work is that correlation doesn't tell us anything about the causes of price transmission. Right? Are prices integrated in two locations because there is really trade and arbitrage going on? Or are they perhaps integrated in two locations because the government is setting prices everywhere? Or because some monopoly supplier of the product is setting monopoly prices everywhere the same? So the correlation coefficient could be high, but it doesn't necessarily mean the markets are efficient and really integrated. The basic regression analysis was basically here using, just standard regression of one price on the other price, or the price changes on the price changes. Very simple sorts of analysis there. Another important shortcoming of this sort of work is that it fails to account for possible non-stationarity. Much of the price data we have is what we would call in econometric terms non-stationary. And because of that, this sort of standard regression analysis essentially fails. It can fool you a lot. Okay? And this is what led then, starting in the 1980s, as the methods were developed, into the use of what is called co-integration econometrics. Okay? The first paper, as far as I know, in agricultural economics, looking at price transmission, was by Ardeni in 1989. And especially in the 1990s, this was a real boom area. Lots and lots of papers published, lots of PhDs, and so on, written on this topic. Okay. Now, the workhorse model, the basis for the great majority of the applied work that is done today in this area, is something called the vector error correction model. Okay? And you'll be seeing this, I think, in a few presentations in the course of the next 1 or 2 days. So at the risk of being a bit technical, I want to show you what that thing looks like, and I want to try to take away any residual fear or inhibitions that you might have about it. Okay? The vector error correction model is sort of a two-step thing. We do two things when we estimate these models. The first thing we do is we estimate what we call the long-run relationship between the two prices, price A and price B. The little t here refers to time, so we have a time series of data for A prices and a time series of data for B prices. And this equation that we estimate here tells us something about the long-run relationship. And the error term here at the end measures the deviations from this long-run equilibrium. It measures whether or not prices are perfectly in equilibrium. If they're perfectly in equilibrium, the error term will equal 0. And if they're not perfectly in equilibrium, the error term will take on some non-zero value. That's the first stage of the price transmission work with a vector error correction model. The second stage looks a bit complicated at first, but it's not so bad. What we do there is we model the changes in prices on market A, and in a second equation, the changes in the prices on market B. Okay. And these changes, that's what the delta here refers to, the triangle, the delta is a change. They are a function of the changes in A and B in previous periods. So this allows some dynamics in the price relationship. Okay. And most importantly, what we do is we take the error term from the first equation here. This is the deviation from the long-run equilibrium. And it enters into these two change equations down here. Okay. So we have the price in market A responding to whether or not in the previous period these prices were in equilibrium or not. If there was a disequilibrium in the previous period, then it feeds into this equation and leads to a change here. And that's why these are called error correction models, because the idea is that this is an error, essentially, the deviation from the equilibrium. And the error here is corrected in this second stage of estimations. So prices are linked by a long-run equilibrium relationship in the first equation, but sometimes they can move apart a little bit. They're not perfectly tightly linked to each other. But when they do move apart a little bit because of shocks or some other processes, in the next period, this deviation is corrected and they are brought back into equilibrium. And we can analyze this sort of relationship here. We can look at the size of some of these coefficients. They will tell us something about the speed and the extent and the symmetry of the price transmission relationship. The nice thing about this sort of model is that it accounts for non-stationarity, so it has some good econometric qualities. It's also kind of nice because it allows for bidirectional causality. When we set up the equation and estimate it this way, the price on A can be influencing B, but also the other way around. And in many cases, we expect that shocks can come from both directions on these markets. Right? If I think of, I don't know, for example, pork in Germany, the producer price of pork and the consumer price of pork meat products. You expect some bidirectional causality there. If there is a shock on the supply level, at the producer level, like, for example, an animal disease, that will, of course, lead to shocks that influence prices. But if we have great weather and the German team wins a soccer game on the weekend, then lots of people go outside and grill and we get demand shocks. And both of these can work on the prices that can come from both sides. And that's both in here. Right? Here we have the supply price changing as a response to things. And here we have the demand price changing as a response to things, influencing each other back and forth. Okay. And the nice thing finally about this model is that it allows us to study both the long-run equilibrium in this equation here and the short-run dynamics in these equations here. So we know what the prices are doing in the long run, but we also know in the short run how they are adjusting and modifying each other and so on to maintain that. So what's the current focus of work in price transmission analysis based on this fundamental model, based on the vector error correction model? Well, most of the work that's being done now is using this basic model and modifying it so that we can look at regime-dependent price transmission, like I said before, for example, with and without trade policy, and so on. Okay. So we have the asymmetric vector error correction model. We have threshold vector error correction models, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Okay. We have various types of exogenous switching vector error correction model. For example, this is the sort of model we would use to look at that case that I talked about before with policy interventions. An export ban, for example. In that case, we know that from outside, policy is imposing regime switches on the model. We have some types of so-called endogenous switching vector error correction. For example, the Markov switching model. I don't think we're going to talk about that in any detail here. But if some of you would like to discuss it in a more technical way, maybe in one of the coffee breaks, I'd be happy to explain a bit what we do there. And recently, we have some people, especially working in a group in Barcelona, Teresa Serra and José María Gil, working in Barcelona on non-parametric vector error correction estimation, okay, which basically allows for much more flexible modeling in some ways. In conclusion, what we have is we have a very rich toolbox. We have lots of fairly sophisticated tools that we can use to study price transmission. But there are some problems here as well. Speaking in econometric terms, most of these models are non-nested in each other. And what that means is that we really can't test them rigorously against each other. Okay? If I give the same data set to one student and ask him to estimate a Markov switching model, and that data set to another student and ask her to estimate a non-parametric model, both are probably, if they're a bit clever and if they spend a bit of time, they're both probably going to produce very nice results. But at the end of the day, it's going to be hard to say this is the right model and that's the wrong model. Okay? And so we have the issues here of model selection. In econometrics, this is a specific topic that is complicated. That makes things a bit difficult. You also have something called the dangers of overfitting. Overfitting, we would say, in econometrics. A lot of these models are so flexible that they can basically fit any data fairly well. And there's the danger at the end of the day that you have nice-looking results, but fundamentally, sophisticated methods are no substitute for knowledge of market institutions. The interpretation is important. It's fairly easy nowadays to press a button on a computer and estimate a sophisticated model. But in a lot of cases, you get results which might look good, but on closer examination, they don't make that much sense. Okay. And what you really need in any team that's going to do this sort of work is you need an individual who knows the econometrics, who knows the sophisticated modeling, who has the toolbox, but you desperately also must have individuals involved who know the specific institutional details of the market in question. Where the data is coming from, what are the characteristics of the products and the actors who are involved, so that at the end you can take your model results and discuss whether or not they're plausible, whether or not they have implications for policy, and so on. So in conclusion, I would say that price transmission is a very exciting and currently relevant area of theoretical and applied research. Okay. There is renewed interest in this area. I think call it demand pull, coming from concerns, especially recent concerns about poverty and hunger as a result of the price peaks. There's also a supply push coming from the advances in econometrics in the last 10 or 15 years, the co-integration methods and so on. And of course, the fact that it's fairly inexpensive now to estimate sophisticated models. You know, on any laptop, you can do things nowadays that 20 years ago would simply have been too expensive computationally. Data are often a limiting factor. Okay? The data that we have to work with as applied economists doing this sort of work are usually not collected with our needs in mind. They are a byproduct of some other work. They're a byproduct of work, for example, by the Statistical Bureau, which collects the data because it has to calculate, for example, cost of living indexes or something like that. They're not necessarily collected with the needs of agricultural economists or econometricians interested in price transmission in mind. Okay? And as a result of that, we often, and these are things we can discuss in more detail over the next day or two if you're interested, there's the question of data frequency that becomes very important. If you want to see how a price on one market is influencing a price on another and how they are reacting and interacting, you generally need some pretty high frequency data. If you only take a look once a year, you're going to miss all sorts of interesting stuff that happens in between. And generally speaking, quarterly, even monthly data is for many of these markets just not interesting enough. Weekly data, daily data is often what you'd really like to have if possible, but of course it's often not available. And especially if we're looking at situations where trade is relevant, we might have weekly or daily price data, but we rarely have anything better than monthly trade data, if even. Often we only have annual trade data. And that is, of course, a limitation. So some of the more interesting research that is being done in this field is research that is done on the basis of data that the scientists collect themselves. We have set up, for example, for the last 5 years, we've had a very detailed data collection effort going on for tomato markets in Ghana, in Africa. 5 locations, bi-weekly price collection, transaction, very detailed process. But now, after 5 years, we've got a very rich data set that we can use a lot of do a lot of interesting things with. But in much of the practical applied work, of course, we don't have that luxury. So we have to think about what we can do, what we can't. An important element in much of this analysis is transaction costs. Transaction costs are that X between the 2 prices in those graphs I showed you, that margin. It's very interesting if you can get data on that. You can often get relatively good data on the cost of transporting a good from A to B. But transaction costs are more than just transport costs, of course. There's costs of insurance, there's other elements of risk, of contract finding, and so on and so forth. Right? And those are often very hard to get a handle on. So in that area, too, we often have data deficiencies. And finally, institutional details about markets, such as, for example, the role of contracts. One problem that we're increasingly having on many European markets when we want to do price transmission analysis, is that the prices that we observe on the spot markets are no longer relevant for a large proportion of the actual transactions. So I can get a spot market price for tomatoes in a wholesale market in Germany, for example. But 80% of the tomatoes that are sold in Germany in the supermarkets never go over the wholesale market anymore. They're directly contracted between the large supermarket chain and the producers in Holland or in Spain. And we don't see those detailed contracts. We don't know what the prices are that those tomatoes were traded for and what the conditions are. So we're missing a large part of the market. We never even see it. We did some work a few years ago on price transmission for avocados. We were looking at the Israeli production of avocados going into Europe. Fascinating market because the producers there, the large kibbutz or large cooperative farms in Israel that produce the avocados, they give them to 1 or 2 large trading companies on a purely consignment basis. The traders then take them to Europe, sell them, and after the fact, after that sale, they then tell the producers what they got and give them a share of that. Contractual details like that are very, very important when it comes to understanding who has market power, who's making the important decisions, and so on and so forth. So there is a brief overview, I hope, to give you an outline of the sorts of questions we can analyze, the sorts of terms we talk about, what are the theoretical underpinnings of the work we do in this area, what are the main empirical tools that we use, and finally, what are some of the open issues and questions that we have to deal with. I hope in this way that I've provided a basis for some of the more specialized and specific presentations that will be made in the next day or two. And well, thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Muchas gracias, Stefan. Agradecemos al profesor Stefan von Kramer por esta excelente introducción al tema de transmisión de precios. Creo que hemos tenido una presentación muy didáctica, empezando por qué es relevante el tema, por qué ha sido relevante en los últimos años, por qué ha surgido un nuevo interés. Una de esas causas, como mencionó él, fue la crisis de los alimentos del 2007-2008, con unos nuevos incrementos de precios últimamente, precios internacionales ahora sobre todo a comienzos del 2011. Entonces hay un renovado interés por estos temas y cómo estos incrementos en los precios internacionales afectan a las economías domésticas y afectan en particular a ciertos grupos vulnerables. En términos metodológicos, creo que también tuvimos una rápida revisión, pero desde los métodos más simples de correlaciones simples hasta los métodos más sofisticados que se están trabajando hoy por hoy, que creo que llegan hasta, digamos, lo más avanzado tal vez serían los métodos de Vector Error Correction Models no paramétricos y los que tienen cambios de regímenes endógenos o exógenos. Y creo que estos 2 días van a ser muy didácticos en introducirnos a nosotros en estos aspectos metodológicos, y también vamos a tener la oportunidad de ver algunas de estas aplicaciones. En cuanto a las conclusiones, también quiero resaltar que hay un tema importante aquí, es de cómo recoger fundamentales o variables fundamentales o aspectos institucionales en las estimaciones, ¿no? Básicamente porque todas estas estimaciones son de series, lo que en econometría se llama series de tiempo, entonces cómo comenzar a combinar series de tiempo con variables fundamentales también va a ser un trabajo importante a futuro. Típicamente el moderador tiene que hacer trabajo de tiempos acá. Acá no he tenido ningún problema porque estamos con los tiempos bastante holgados, así es que tenemos 15 minutos para preguntas. Les recuerdo, por favor, me dicen que usemos los micrófonos, dado que hay una grabación que se está haciendo. Entonces, por favor, quienes quieran intervenir, levanten la mano y les alcanzarán los micrófonos. Adelante.
Muchas gracias, Miguel, por la excelente síntesis y al profesor von Kramon por la muy clara presentación. Nosotros estamos hablando en transmisión de precios usted mencionó algunos criterios relacionados a la eficiencia con la cual los precios se transmiten, velocidad, simetría, magnitud, todo eso traducido en una transmisión completa o no tan completa. Eso puede ser algo subjetivo dependiendo con qué lo estamos comparando. En su experiencia, en los mercados que usted ha analizado, ¿qué es una transmisión eficiente de precios en términos de velocidad, magnitud, simetría? Yo sé que usted ha hecho trabajos en la parte de trigo, por ejemplo, en ese mercado, por ejemplo, porque acontece que muchas veces cuando tenemos resultados le asignamos adjetivos, como que es completa, incompleta, parcialmente completa, pero nunca es claro en relación a qué el investigador está haciendo esa afirmación. Gracias.
That is an important question, thank you, and I'm afraid we really can't answer it yet, because I don't think the necessary synthesis work has been done. If you look at the literature, there are now hundreds of papers and articles that each look at price transmission in a specific setting for a certain country and a certain product, or a certain group of countries and a certain product. But no one has really yet sat down and taken all those papers together and created the sort of the baseline that you're talking about. In other words, on average for wheat, how fast and how complete is price transmission? And what countries are faster, what countries are slower, for example. There is some work that has been done now by the World Bank and by the FAO, and tomorrow I will talk to you a little bit about a project that we are currently doing for the World Bank that is trying to do exactly that. We're trying to collect all the evidence that has been produced so far in the academic and in the applied policy literature, and to draw it all together and to create that sort of baseline. What is, on average, price transmission, the speed and the extent? And are there any regularities? Is it faster in developed countries and slower in developing countries? Is it faster for, as we would expect, countries that have harbors, international ports, as opposed to, for example, countries that are landlocked, etc., etc. So I can't answer it yet, but this is obviously a deficit, and it's something that's being worked on right now.
Muchas gracias por la excelente presentación. muy didáctica, ¿no? Se siente que uno puede entender, digamos, lo básico e ir progresando. Se ve la calidad de profesor que tiene Stephen. Tal vez es un comentario lo que yo voy a hacer y no una pregunta. La preocupación en Centroamérica surge también durante la crisis del alza de precios del 2008, y aquí estamos hablando de mercados muy pequeños, aún juntando todo Centroamérica, estamos hablando de un mercado muy pequeño, y entonces el problema de la transmisión de precios se siente tal vez mucho más, porque hay, además de eso, instituciones, empresas con fuertes poderes de negociación, productores dispersos, un sector rural muy amplio, tal vez con la excepción de Costa Rica. Entonces, el problema de la transmisión de precios en Centroamérica es muy agudo, a mi parecer. No sé si ustedes tienen experiencia con analizar países de esta magnitud, de este tamaño. Pero ahora vamos a ver durante la discusión de los casos cómo la transmisión de precios está afectando tanto a productores como a consumidores, y hay que ver qué opciones hay para que las políticas puedan mitigar estos efectos negativos. Por otro lado está también el impacto que tiene sobre la pobreza en Centroamérica, que es muy aguda. La mayoría del ingreso de la mitad de la población, hasta un 60% del ingreso se dedica al consumo de alimentos. Entonces estamos hablando de cosas extremadamente sensitivas. Y muchas gracias de nuevo por la presentación.
Thank you very much for the question. I have to move through here in a sec to get to the... Sorry, we're almost there. When we think of this basic model, I said that one of the advantages of it was that it allows for bidirectional causality. When we look at countries like the countries in Latin America or Central America, well, not Latin America, because of course countries like Argentina and Brazil are different in that respect, but if we look at the smaller economies in Latin America and Central America, then the bidirectionality isn't really an issue, right? Because the world market is the dog and you are the tail when it comes to these important products such as wheat and so on. When I analyze a country such as Ukraine or Argentina, it's the other way around. It works in both directions. Argentina is, of course, influenced by world market developments, but it also influences world market developments. Whereas for many of the products we're looking at here, you are a recipient of shocks from the world market, but you don't produce shocks that have a major or noticeable impact on the world market, at least as regards the staple products. That simplifies things to some extent, but the complication comes here, especially I find in my own experience in this part of the world, the complication comes from the sorts of products that you're interested in, okay? Because they are often a bit more difficult to analyze in this respect. First of all, there is a variety of sort of fruit and vegetable type products for which it's really hard to identify a clear world market, a world market signal, and so on. These products are strongly seasonal. So often in your price series there are gaps, there are holes. You have data for the first 3 months of the year, but you don't have data for the other months of the year because the product isn't coming onto the market. That creates a whole series of methodological difficulties for us. The other thing is that when we deal with livestock products, things generally get milk or meat and so on, which is also something that's of importance in the region. Things tend to get a bit more complicated as well. Okay? We've done a fair amount of work, and this is where, for example, the question of asymmetry becomes very interesting. The idea that when the producer prices increase, the results are different than if they decrease, and so on. The problem with doing work for these sorts of products is that in the course of processing, the product has changed dramatically. And you lose a lot of the product, as it were. So we have, at the producer level, we have a slaughter pig, for example. At the wholesale level, maybe we get prices for 4 or 5 large cuts of pork, parts of the slaughter pig, but not all of it anymore. Some parts of that pig, the hide and other things, have disappeared into, and we don't see them anymore. And when we get to the consumer level, at the retail store, we see maybe prices for 7 or 8 cuts of pork, small cuts of pork, but that only represents at the end maybe 30 or 40% of the original slaughter pig. And so putting all of that together and understanding the price transmission fully becomes very, very complicated. And that's my experience in dealing with these countries and these regions here. The products that you are largely interested in, the question of the world market wheat price and the prices of flour and bread in Costa Rica, that's one question. That's fairly easy to deal with. But the whole fruit and vegetable sector, the whole livestock sector, milk and meat, that's considerably more difficult. The size of the country per se isn't necessarily a problem if you have good data, if you have good statistical recording of the data. As a matter of fact, the small size of some of these countries, as I said here, has some methodological advantages because we don't have to worry about causality in both directions. I hope that roughly addresses your question.
Muchas gracias por la presentación, realmente coincido en que muy didáctica. Y quería hacer un pequeño comentario referente a eso último que estaba comentando. Nosotros en el ICA hemos hecho algunos ejercicios de transmisión de precios no basados en métodos econométricos, sino basados en métodos contables, usando matrices de contabilidad social o los sabidos bancarios, identificando la participación de cada uno de los factores dentro de la estructura de costo total, para ver cuánto impactaría un aumento de precios en alguno de esos factores. Y lo que hemos encontrado es un gran problema en eso que usted dice. Hay diferentes tipologías de productores. Digamos, en Centroamérica hay muchos tipos de productores, desde productores totalmente tecnificados a productores que son cero tecnificados. Y cuando uno quiere hacer un ejercicio de ver cuánto impactaría la variación en el precio de algún factor, se encuentra en que tenés 15 tipos de productores y que ese factor tiene diferente participación en esas 15 estructuras de costos. Y los sabidos bancarios y las matrices de contabilidad social lo que te dan son promedios nacionales, que al final no representa la realidad de ninguno, es una suma y una división de todos. Y además, eso que usted decía, tenemos mercados para pocos meses del año, tenemos muchos huecos, muchísimos huecos de información, muchos huecos de información, y en la mayoría de los mercados, y la mayoría de los mercados centroamericanos no son mercados formales, entonces no llevan estadísticas, hay 3 o 4 precios para un mismo producto. Entonces hemos contado, en ese ejercicio fue, tuvimos digamos en ese momento todas las dificultades posibles, dificultades de información, dificultades de metodología, dificultades. Entonces en la región se ha dificultado hacer estudios, sobre todo para la pequeña agricultura, que es la que tiene menos disponibilidad de información, se ha dificultado hacer estudios de transmisión de precios, por lo menos para el ICA.
Yeah, I think that was more of a comment than a question, and I agree there are difficulties.
Mi pregunta está relacionada con lo que planteaba Hugo y tiene que ver con la calidad de la información. Los resultados de los modelos, de acuerdo con lo que usted planteaba en su presentación, dependen en buena medida de la calidad de los datos que ingresen a esos modelos. Y en Centroamérica, en general, tenemos serias dificultades o problemas de calidad en la información disponible de variables, digamos, agregadas. Pero bueno, si ya entramos a información tan específica como la que tuviera requerirse para hacer un análisis como el que usted ha planteado o alimentar alguno de estos modelos, pues es aún más complicado. Lo que quisiera saber es si ustedes tienen algún tema, han desarrollado algunas metodologías de auditoría de los datos para asegurar pues cierto control de calidad o pues un estándar mínimo de calidad en la información para que los modelos puedan pues funcionar y generar información pues razonable para la toma de decisiones. Gracias.
Sorry, at the end I'm not sure I understood what the question was. Could someone help me?
Maybe I can translate a little bit.
Please.
The question is about methods to sort of data cleaning. Like, how can we make sure that the price data is accurate? So what methods we can use, or data cleaning, basically?
Yeah.
To know if you have developed an auditing or a methodology to ensure the quality of information that you are using in your models. Because if the information is bad, so the results are not going to give you enough information about how the market is working.
Yeah. Thank you. That is a very important issue, and I think what you're talking about is what I sort of made as my last point here, that sophisticated methods are no substitute for knowledge of the market institutions. And one of the most important pieces of knowledge there is knowledge about how are the price data that we have, how are they collected, and how are they processed. Usually when we get this price data out of the statistics or something, it's been collected by somebody else and it's been processed by somebody else. And we have to know how that's happening. If it's a weekly price, is that a weekly price as the average of 5 daily prices that someone has taken? Or is it the market closing price on Friday afternoon? Or is it the market opening price on... In some cases in Germany, we have a weekly price, but it's produced by what we call a Notierungskommission, which is basically just a group of market experts that get together for a telephone conference once a week and say, yeah, it's about 450. You know, it's not necessarily because they've measured 450, it's because they all deal in the trade and they know that this week most of the transactions were around 450. We have to know that sort of stuff. In the sense that you're asking whether we have sort of established procedures or auditing procedures for data, I would say no, because it really depends on the specific market. But in the specific case that you're working on, as I said, you need the econometric people who can do the analysis, but you also need some people who know how the market works, where the data is coming from, and who can then take a look at your results and react. So what we will sometimes do if we're doing some work on pork markets in Germany, when I have some first results, I'll get on the phone to a former student who works for one of the big meat packing firms, and I'll tell him, listen, this is what we're getting. Is this reasonable? And if he laughs at me on the phone, then I know that it's probably not reasonable. We've made a mistake. If he says, yes, that's the reasonable, that's the order of magnitude, then we feel okay. There are, of course, standard things you do with data when you get it. Make a graph, look for outliers, look at distributions, and so on, to identify data quality issues. Some of the FAO data, for example, at least used to be. You can tell, if you look at price series, you see suddenly for some countries, for 2 or 3 years, just it's constant. You know, probably because there was no report from the local office or whatever, and so the assumption is simply, well, you have to know about things like that, and you look for things like that in the data, of course, before you do any analysis.
¿Tenemos algunas preguntas adicionales?
Yo creo,
Dos.
un comentario.
Adelante.
Yo creo que un tema que ha salido en esta primera discusión, y para que queden los proceedings, es el tema de calidad de los datos. Y me parece importante enfatizar que estamos tratando de generar recomendaciones de políticas a problemas complejos como es el tema de transparencia de mercados, concentración de mercados, y estamos teniendo una primera dificultad en la región, y es que la información que se está produciendo por los Servicios Nacionales de Estadística no nos están permitiendo enfocar la complejidad de los problemas de los mercados en la actualidad. Creo que un primer esfuerzo en este proceso que eventualmente se desprenda de este seminario debe comenzar por tratar de identificar mercados en donde nosotros creemos que tenemos que trabajar y iniciar un proceso de recolección de datos por un periodo de tiempo que después nos permita el poder con seguridad hacer afirmaciones que eventualmente se traduzcan en recomendaciones de políticas. Entonces, creo que sale una conclusión muy importante de esta primera presentación, más allá de la explicación bastante clara de la metodología, y es la necesidad de contar con una base de datos lo suficientemente sólida para poder extraer el tipo de recomendaciones que estamos tratando de extraer de este esfuerzo. Un comentario. Gracias.
Muchas gracias. Realmente muy ilustrativa tu presentación. La pregunta que yo tengo es si en una de las conclusiones hemos dicho o has dicho que no podemos comparar modelos hechos con un enfoque, con modelos hechos con otro enfoque. En la práctica, en la actualidad, ¿cómo se llega a un consenso de cuál podría ser lo más cercano a la verdad?
First of all, there are econometric criterion. There are ways of comparing models even if they're not directly nested. Even if you can't do this in a rigorous sort of testing way, there are still indicators that tell you what's fitting better and what isn't. But again, and this gets back to my answer to the last question, again, it's a question of market institutions and working with people who are knowledgeable about how the market works. Because each of these models that we have here, even if they're all related, has its own very distinct interpretation. And the sorts of stories that you can tell or interpretations of how markets are functioning for each type of model is very different. And at the end of the day, it's not just a question about whether your results are statistically significant, it's also a question of whether they're economically plausible and relevant. Okay? And that's what you have to sit down and do then. Okay? So in some cases where we know that policy has changed over time, export bans or something like that, then we automatically think of sorts of switching models. An asymmetric model is probably simply not going to be so interesting in that particular case. And in cases where we expect, for example, spatial trade, we automatically think of a threshold model because the threshold model fits in these cases of spatial trade, and the others not so well. So it's really, I mean, like a lot of things in science, when you take a closer look at them, if the work is going to be good and relevant, then it's a science to a certain extent, but it's also a bit of an art. It's also a bit of an art, and you need to work with people who know how the markets are functioning and who can tell you whether or not your empirical results make